to not mince about exactly what's happening with the obtaining of FBS, basically when a cow goes in for slaughter and they work out that it's pregnant, they kill it like they always plan to do. But what they do is they take the fetus out of the cow, and then they put a needle into the heart of the fetus while it's still kind of alive, and draw blood from it. Okay, so you can, just as it sounds, it's not a very nice process, and it's still kind of in contention whether the fetus can actually feel the pain of obviously a needle going into its heart and blood being extracted. So you could argue that, you know, that cow is going to get slaughtered anyway. The fetus is unborn, so it's not really adding to the issue of kind of animal ethics. But it definitely doesn't play towards the whole idea of cultivated meat being a kind of cruelty-free product. Today I am talking about growth factors and serum. So it's kind of like one episode covering two definitions, but bear with me because you probably understand why I've done them in one, as I think they link together quite well. So as always, let's start with some basic stuff. Let's try and work from the start and get towards the more complicated stuff. Okay, so with cultivated meat, what we are doing in the process is submerging these animal cells in a special liquid. Okay, we'll call it a broth, and that broth is designed especially to make those cells grow, to make those cells multiply in number, and also to make those cells convert and change into the type of cells that we actually want to eat. Okay, now that liquid that the cells are submerged in is called a growth medium, and I do have a separate episode just covering off those definitions if you want to get into a little bit more of that. But what I want to do today is actually hone in on a specific element of that growth medium, which is the growth factors. So the growth medium as a whole is basically providing the animal cell that we're trying to grow all of the elements that it needs in order to do those roles. And as I said earlier, the growth factors are a group of proteins within the growth medium that do a specific or play a specific and important role. And you'll probably find the term growth factors crop up a lot if you're reading any like academic stuff. It's not really mentioned, I don't find, too much in kind of just news articles. And you definitely hear a lot of mention of serum or FBS, particularly when reading articles that are maybe critical of the cultivated meat space. So that's why I'm kind of capping them off both as one. Okay, so going back to growth factors first, let's just look a little bit about what they actually are and what they do. So growth factors are essentially, think of them like an instruction manual for the cells, telling them what to do and how to do the task in terms of, you know, growing into a certain type of cell, or differentiating into a certain type of cell. So it's kind of like a very, very specific instruction booklet that the scientists are putting into the growth medium in order to make sure those animal cells turn into the type of cells that we actually want. Okay. I think it's worth mentioning there are other elements of the growth medium, such as hormones, that kind of do a similar task, okay? And there's a little bit of overlap here, but for the kind of the aim of keeping kind of things quite simple, let's just focus in on the growth factors, okay? So if a growth factor wasn't added, or growth factors weren't added into the culture medium, or the growth medium, the cells would likely still survive, you know, but they wouldn't thrive, okay? They wouldn't do exactly what we would want them to do if we're trying to culture meat. So it wouldn't turn into the type of cells in the desired way that we want. So think of it like that. The growth factors are kind of allowing us to carry out very, very specific tasks. In terms of where growth factors come from in an animal, and I think it's important to go back to how it happens in a traditional sense, animals produce their own growth factors. So this is a naturally occurring thing within an animal. And what happens in the animal is it sends those growth factors around the rest of its body in its blood. Okay, so it can get to all of the other cells in the body. So those cells are then get those specific instructions of what they're supposed to do. Okay, and this is why this then links to the term serum. Okay, so as I said, you've got the animals, they're producing these growth factors and pumping these growth factors around their body through blood. Now, if you take that blood of an animal and you remove the things like the blood cells and the clotting factors and other bits and pieces that are not related to growth factors, if you remove all of that stuff out, what you're left is something called a serum. So a serum is kind of like a highly complex, let's say, liquid that comes from an animal's blood that contains, it's very nutritious. It contains a lot of growth factors and other really important elements, I think, for cell cultivation. So back in the 1950s, scientists kind of started using the blood from a cow fetus, okay, because they found that this was very, very rich in growth factors and really, really good for cell cultivation. And as it sounds, it's the blood from a baby cow, and it's abbreviated as FBS, so Fetal Bovine Serum. Okay, now, although it still continues to be very highly used within the cell cultivation space as a whole, it does have some drawbacks, particularly when you're using it for cultivated meat production. So let's cover those off. Firstly is the cost. It's a very expensive thing to not only purchase, but also the nature of where it comes from as in an animal. It has a lot of variation in the different batches, contamination and things like that. So there's a lot of effort that has to go on after you get the FBS to actually make it usable for cultivated meat. And that is also expensive. So overall, it's a factor that really pushes up the cost of growth medium as a whole, and therefore pushes up the cost of the production of cultivated meat. And the second factor is ultimately it doesn't really sit very well with the kind of branding of cultivated meat companies saying that they're kind of cruelty free. To not mince about exactly what's happening with the obtaining of FBS, basically when a cow goes in for slaughter and they work out that it's pregnant, they kill it like they always plan to do. But what they do is they take the fetus out of the cow and then they put a needle into the heart of the fetus while it's still kind of alive and draw blood from it. Okay, so you can, just as it sounds, it's not a very nice process, and it's still kind of in contention whether the fetus can actually feel the pain of obviously a needle going into its heart and blood being extracted. So you could argue that that cow is going to get slaughtered anyway. The fetus is unborn, so it's not really adding to the issue of kind of animal ethics. But it definitely doesn't play towards the whole idea of cultivated meat being a kind of cruelty-free product. And therefore, you've got companies just trying to get away from being associated with it. So to summarize, from an FBS drawback point of view, you've got the high cost and you've also got those kind of ethical concerns. So FBS is still being used in the cultivated meat sector from what I can see, mainly kind of I think on smaller scale. But if you go on the websites of some of the companies that are getting closer to making bigger scale production, they will state that they're not using FBS and they're actually using kind of serum-free alternatives. So let's get into that, okay? Let's get into what a serum-free alternative is. Essentially, as I said, as it kind of sounds, it's a way of cultivating meat without using serum and generally without using any kind of animal sources. Now, I've done quite a lot of reading into that space to kind of understand what people are using. And as always, everybody's always a bit kind of loose with details with cultivated meat. But from what I understand, the most frequently used technique in order to grow meat without serum is to use a technique called recombinant DNA technology. Sounds pretty complex. I think it is pretty complex, but I'm going to try and lay it out for you in a nice and simple way. So recombinant DNA technology is basically a type of genetic modification. Okay, um, it's working with DNA, as you can probably gather from the name. And what DNA is kind of like a blueprint of a cell. Okay, so it's kind of a blueprint that guides a cell on what it is and how it should act and what its function is. So what scientists do when using this recombinant DNA technology is they basically cut a piece of the DNA from an animal cell, okay, and then they paste it into like a host, and that host is usually either bacteria, yeast, or a plant cell, and they put those host cells into a condition where they then grow. And because those host cells have now got this kind of like not stolen but like pasted DNA from this animal cell, when those host cells are actually like growing, they're then producing things like recombinant proteins, growth factors, hormones that the animal otherwise would. So that's kind of the way that they're essentially bypassing the use of an animal. So hopefully that kind of summarizes everything for you and links where kind of growth medium, growth factors, and serum all come together, because I definitely found it confusing before kind of doing my research on this topic. And just to leave it kind of to finalize, I think one thing that I find is important to consider is these serum-free alternatives, although they do get around the kind of animal ethics issue of using FBS, it does seem that the cost of them is still very, very high. And I think in some cases actually more expensive than using FBS. So there's still, I think, a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of improving that side of things. So, the use of FBS can be completely eliminated, because I think pretty much everybody's on the same page that it's not really the best solution when producing cultivated meat. All right. Thanks again. Bye.